The rain had been falling steadily for hours, a relentless downpour that turned the streets of New York City into shimmering rivers of reflected neon. Ethan Cross hurried through the deluge, his coat pulled tight around him, the collar turned up against the cold. He had been working late at the archives again, poring over old newspapers and documents for his latest project, a book on the history of urban legends in the city. It was tedious work, but Ethan loved it. There was something thrilling about uncovering forgotten stories, about peeling back the layers of time to reveal the secrets buried beneath. The archives were housed in a nondescript building on the edge of the financial district, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow aisles, each one lined with towering shelves filled with boxes of documents, microfilm reels, and ancient newspapers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, and the only sound was the occasional hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Ethan had been working in the archives for weeks, and he had developed a routine. He would arrive early in the morning, grab a coffee from the cart on the corner, and then spend the day sifting through boxes of material, taking notes, and scanning documents into his laptop. He had become so engrossed in his work that he often lost track of time, and it wasn't uncommon for him to still be there long after the sun had set. Tonight was no different. The rain had started just as he was finishing up for the day, and he had decided to wait it out in the archives rather than brave the storm. He had been going through a box of newspapers from the early 1900s looking for any mention of the infamous Lady in White, a ghost said to haunt the old mansions of Fifth Avenue. The stories were mostly the same, tales of a woman in a flowing white dress who would appear to unsuspecting passers-by, only to vanish into thin air. But as Ethan flipped through the brittle pages of a newspaper from 1923, something caught his eye. It was a photograph, small and grainy, but unmistakable. It showed a man standing on a crowded street, his face turned slightly away from the camera. He was wearing a long coat and a hat, and he looked familiar. Ethan leaned in closer, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. The man in the photograph looked exactly like him. At first, he thought it must be a coincidence. After all, there were only so many ways a person could look, and it wasn't impossible for someone from 100 years ago to bear a passing resemblance to him. But the more he stared at the photograph, the more certain he became. The shape of the face, the set of the jaw, even the way the man held himself, it was all too familiar. It was him. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be possible? The newspaper was from 1923, nearly 100 years ago. He hadn't even been born yet. And yet, there he was, staring back at himself from the pages of history. He quickly scanned the article that accompanied the photograph. It was a short piece, just a few paragraphs, about a mysterious figure who had been seen wandering the streets of the city. The man had been spotted in several different neighborhoods, always alone, always at night. Witnesses described him as tall and thin, with a pale complexion and dark eyes. He never spoke, never interacted with anyone, and would disappear as suddenly as he appeared. The article ended with a quote from a local police officer, who speculated that the man might be a ghost or some other supernatural entity. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had always been fascinated by the idea of the supernatural, but he had never really believed in it. Ghosts, time travel, doppelgangers, they were the stuff of fiction, not reality. And yet, here he was, looking at a photograph of himself from 100 years ago. He quickly snapped a picture of the article with his phone and then carefully folded the newspaper back into the box. His mind was still reeling as he packed up his things and headed for the door. The rain had let up slightly, but the streets were still slick with water and the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete. As he walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the photograph following him. But the streets were empty, save for the occasional passing car. By the time he reached his apartment, Ethan was exhausted. He tossed his coat onto the couch and collapsed into a chair, his mind still racing. He pulled out his phone and stared at the photograph he had taken. The man in the picture was definitely him. There was no doubt about it. But how? How could he have been in a photograph from 1923? It didn't make any sense. And yet, there it was, staring him in the face. Ethan knew he needed to find out more. He needed to know who this man was, why he looked exactly like him, and what it all meant. But where to start? The newspaper article had been vague, and there was no way to track down the witnesses from 100 years ago. As he sat there, staring at the photograph, a thought occurred to him. What if this wasn't the only time he had appeared in the past? What if there were other photographs, other sightings? If he could find more evidence, maybe he could piece together what was going on. With a renewed sense of purpose, Ethan grabbed his laptop and began to search. He started with the archives, looking for any other mentions of the mysterious man from 1923. But as he dug deeper, he began to find something even more unsettling. There were other photographs. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard, his eyes glued to the screen as he scoured digital archives, historical databases, and obscure forums dedicated to urban legends. The photograph from 1923 had opened a door, and now he was determined to step through it. He needed answers, no matter how unsettling they might be. Hours passed, and the glow of his laptop screen was the only light in his apartment. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows like a persistent, uninvited guest. Ethan barely noticed. His focus was absolute, his mind consumed by the growing pile of evidence he was uncovering. The first new photograph he found was from 1947. It was a grainy black and white image of a crowd gathered in Times Square, celebrating the end of World War II. Amid the sea of jubilant faces, there he was, or rather, the man who looked exactly like him. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his expression somber, out of place amidst the celebration. He wore a different coat this time, but the face was unmistakable. Ethan's face. The caption beneath the photograph was brief, mysterious figure spotted during VJ Day celebrations. Witnesses claim he vanished moments after this photo was taken. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. He dug deeper, his search growing more frantic. Another photograph surfaced, this one from 1975. It was a candid shot taken at a protest in Central Park. The man, Ethan's doppelganger, stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, watching silently. The caption read, "Unidentified man seen at anti-war rally. Disappeared before authorities could question him." The pattern was clear. Every few decades, this man appeared, always in the background, always watching, always silent. And always he looked exactly like Ethan. But the most chilling discovery came next. Ethan stumbled upon a series of articles from the late 1800s. They were handwritten, scanned from old newspapers, their ink faded and smudged. One article, dated 1892, described a series of strange occurrences in a small town in upstate New York. A man matching Ethan's description had been seen wandering the streets at night, peering into windows and disappearing without a trace. The townsfolk had dubbed him the Watcher. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the article. The Watcher. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had to follow him. He had to know who or what this man was. Grabbing his coat, he bolted out of his apartment and down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The street was deserted when he emerged, the air thick with the scent of rain and damp concrete. He looked left, then right, but there was no sign of the man. He was gone, as if he had never been there at all. But Ethan knew better. He had seen him. He had heard him. "Find me." The words echoed in his mind, a command he couldn't ignore. He began to walk, his footsteps quick and purposeful. He didn't know where he was going, but he felt a strange pull, as if an invisible thread were guiding him. The city around him seemed to blur, the lights of the buildings and cars melting into a haze of color and sound. He was no longer in control. Something else was leading him. After what felt like hours, he found himself standing in front of an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. It was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its windows boarded up, its facade covered in graffiti. A rusted sign above the door read, "Blackwood Asylum." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard of Blackwood Asylum before. It was a place of legend, a place where the city's darkest secrets were buried. It had been closed for decades, but the stories persisted, stories of experiments, disappearances, and madness. The pull grew stronger, drawing him toward the building. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know. Pushing open the creaking door, he stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, the floor littered with broken furniture and debris. The walls were covered in peeling paint and strange symbols, etched into the surface as if by a madman's hand. As he ventured deeper into the asylum, he began to hear whispers, soft, indistinct voices echoing through the halls. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder as he moved forward. Finally, he reached a door at the end of a long corridor. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. The whispers were coming from behind it. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves filled with jars and vials. In the center of the room stood a table covered in papers and strange instruments. And sitting at the table was the man from the photographs. He looked up as Ethan entered, his eyes meeting Ethan's with an intensity that made Ethan's blood run cold. He was older now, his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking him. It was Ethan, or at least a version of him. "You found me," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I knew you would." Ethan's mouth was dry, his voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "I'm you," he said. "Or rather, I'm what you will become." The room seemed to close in around Ethan as the words hung in the air. "I'm what you will become." The man's voice was calm, almost resigned, but it carried a weight that made Ethan's chest tighten. He took a step back, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "What are you talking about?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling. "This is impossible. You can't be me. I'm here. Now. You're from the past. Or the future. Or, I don't even know." The older Ethan, if that's what he was, leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Time isn't as linear as you think," he said. "It's more like a river, twisting and turning, folding back on itself. Sometimes the currents cross. Sometimes they collide." Ethan shook his head, trying to push away the growing sense of dread. "That doesn't explain anything. How are you here? Why do you look like me? And why have you been following me?" The older Ethan sighed as if he had been expecting these questions but was still weary of answering them. "I'm not following you," he said. "I'm trying to warn you. To stop you from making the same mistakes I did." "Mistakes? What mistakes?" The older Ethan stood slowly, his movements stiff as if every step caused him pain. He walked over to one of the shelves and picked up a small, dusty jar. Inside was a strange, glowing substance faintly pulsating with a bluish light. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding up the jar. Ethan shook his head, his eyes fixed on the glowing substance. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. "It's time," the older Ethan said. "Or rather, a fragment of it. A piece of the river frozen in a moment. I've spent years collecting these fragments, trying to understand how they work. Trying to find a way to change what's already happened." Ethan's mind was spinning. "You're saying you can manipulate time?" The older Ethan nodded. "In a way. But it's not as simple as it sounds. Every action has consequences. Every change ripples through the timeline, creating new branches, new possibilities. And some of those possibilities, they're worse than what you're trying to fix." Ethan took a step closer, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "What are you trying to fix? What happened to you?" The older Ethan's expression darkened. "I made a choice," he said. "A choice that seemed right at the time, but it led to this." He gestured to the room around them, to the jars and vials, to the symbols etched into the walls. "I thought I could use time to save someone I loved. But I was wrong. And now I'm trapped, caught between moments, unable to move forward or back." Ethan's heart sank. "Who did you try to save?" The older Ethan hesitated, as if the memory was too painful to speak aloud. "Her name was Clara," he said finally. "She was everything to me. But she died. And I couldn't accept it. I thought if I could just go back, just change one moment, I could save her. But time doesn't work that way. It fights back. It twists your intentions, turns them into something monstrous." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to her? The older Ethan's eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "I tried to save her," he said. "But instead I erased her. She's gone, Ethan. Not just from my life, but from existence itself. And now I'm stuck here, trying to undo what I've done, but every attempt only makes it worse." Ethan's mind was reeling. He didn't want to believe it, but the older Ethan's words rang with a terrible truth. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" The older Ethan set the jar back on the shelf and turned to face him. "I want you to stop," he said. "Before it's too late. Before you make the same mistakes I did. You're at a crossroads, Ethan. You have a choice to make. And if you choose wrong, you'll end up like me, trapped, alone, and haunted by what you've lost." Ethan shook his head, his voice rising in frustration. "I don't even know what choice you're talking about. What am I supposed to do?" The older Ethan stepped closer, his eyes burning with intensity. "You'll know," he said. "When the time comes, you'll know. And when it does, I need you to remember this moment. Remember what I've told you. Because if you don't, if you make the wrong choice, you'll destroy everything." Before Ethan could respond, the older Ethan reached out and grabbed his arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers cold as ice. "Promise me," he said, his voice urgent. Promise me you'll remember." Ethan nodded, too stunned to speak. I promise." The older Ethan released him and stepped back, his expression softening. "Good," he said. "Now go, before it's too late." Ethan turned and stumbled out of the room, his mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. The whispers in the asylum grew louder as he ran, echoing in his ears like a chorus of ghosts. He didn't stop until he was outside, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. He looked back at the asylum, its dark silhouette looming against the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in one of the upper windows, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. As he walked away, the older Ethan's words echoed in his mind. "You're at a crossroads. You have a choice to make. But what choice? And when?" Ethan didn't know. But he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. Ethan's walk home was a blur. The streets of New York, usually so alive with noise and movement, felt eerily silent, as if the city itself were holding its breath. His mind was a storm of thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. The older Ethan's words echoed in his head, a haunting refrain he couldn't escape. "You're at a crossroads. You have a choice to make. But what choice? And when?" The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let go. By the time he reached his apartment, the first light of dawn was breaking over the skyline. He collapsed onto the couch, his body exhausted but his mind still racing. He needed to make sense of what had happened, to find some thread of logic in the chaos. He grabbed his laptop and began to search, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He looked up everything he could find about Blackwood Asylum, about time manipulation, about Clara. But the more he searched, the more he realized how little there was to find. Blackwood Asylum had been closed for decades, and most of its records had been lost or destroyed. Time manipulation was the stuff of science fiction, and Clara was a ghost, a name without a face, a story without an ending. Frustrated, Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes. He needed to think, to piece together what he knew. The older Ethan had said he was trying to save Clara, but instead he had erased her. He had tried to manipulate time and it had backfired. But how? And why did he think Ethan was at risk of making the same mistake? Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He froze, his heart pounding. Who would be knocking at this hour? He wasn't expecting anyone, and the thought of facing another stranger, or worse, another version of himself, filled him with dread. The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan stood slowly, his legs trembling, and approached the door. He peered through the peephole, half expecting to see the older Ethan standing there. But instead, he saw a woman. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with dark hair and piercing green eyes. She looked familiar. Ethan opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "Hi, Ethan," she said. "My name is Clara." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Clara. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. She looked exactly like the woman he had imagined when the older Ethan spoke her name. But that was impossible. Clara was gone. Erased. Wasn't she? "How do you know my name?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara's smile faded. "We don't have much time," she said. "Can I come in?" Ethan hesitated, but something in her eyes, something desperate, something urgent, made him step aside. She entered the apartment, her movements graceful but tense, as if she were carrying a great weight. "Who are you?" Ethan asked as he closed the door. "And how do you know me?" Clara turned to face him, her green eyes locking onto his. "I'm someone who shouldn't exist," she said. "But because of you, I do." Ethan's mind was reeling. "Because of me? What are you talking about?" Clara took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. "You haven't made the choice yet," she said. "But you will. And when you do, it will change everything. Not just for you, but for me. For all of us." Ethan shook his head, his frustration boiling over. "What choice? Everyone keeps talking about this choice, but no one will tell me what it is." Clara stepped closer, her voice softening. "It's about time," she said. "About trying to change the past. You'll be tempted, Ethan. You'll want to fix something to make things right. But you can't. If you try, you'll only make it worse." Ethan's heart was pounding now. "Are you talking about the older Ethan? The one who tried to save you?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she said. "He thought he could save me. But instead, he erased me. And now I'm here, but I'm not supposed to be. I'm a mistake, Ethan. A fracture in time. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. If he erased you, how are you here? Clara smiled sadly. Because of you, she said. You haven't made the choice yet, but you will. And when you do, it will create a new branch, a new possibility. That's why I'm here. To warn you. To stop you from making the same mistake. Ethan's head was spinning. But if I haven't made the choice yet, how do you know about it? How do you know what's going to happen? Clara reached out and took his hand, her touch warm but fleeting. Time isn't linear, she said. It's a web, a tapestry. And sometimes the threads cross. Sometimes we catch glimpses of what's to come. That's how I know. That's why I'm here. Ethan stared at her, his mind struggling to keep up. What happens if I make the wrong choice? He asked. What happens to you? Clara's grip tightened for a moment, then she let go. I disappear, she said. Again. And this time, there won't be any coming back. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, but the thought of her being erased, of her suffering because of something he might do, was unbearable. What do I do? He asked, his voice breaking. How do I stop this? Clara smiled, but there was no joy in it. You can't, she said. Not entirely, but you can choose differently. You can let go. You can accept that some things can't be changed. Ethan shook his head. That's not enough. There has to be something else. Something I can do. Clara reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing against his cheek. You're a good person, Ethan, she said, but you can't save everyone. Sometimes the hardest choice is the one to let go. Before Ethan could respond, Clara stepped back, her form beginning to shimmer, as if she were fading away. I have to go, she said. But remember what I've told you. Remember the choice. Wait. Ethan reached out, but his hand passed through her, as if she were made of smoke. Don't go. Clara smiled one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Goodbye, Ethan, she said, and then she was gone, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. Ethan stood there, his hands still outstretched, his heart aching with a loss he couldn't fully understand. He didn't know what to do, what to think. But one thing was clear, he was running out of time. Ethan spent the next few days in a daze. Clara's visit had left him shaken, her words echoing in his mind like a mantra he couldn't escape. You're at a crossroads. You have a choice to make. But what choice? And when? The uncertainty was maddening. He tried to distract himself with work, burying himself in the archives. But even there, he couldn't escape the past. Every old photograph, every faded newspaper article, seemed to hold a hidden message, a clue he couldn't quite decipher. He found himself searching for more evidence of the man who looked like him, the man who might be him, but the trail had gone cold. It was as if the older Ethan had vanished, leaving only questions in his wake. Then, one evening, as Ethan was walking home from the archives, it happened. He was crossing a quiet street when he heard it, a sound that stopped him in his tracks. It was a voice, faint but unmistakable. A voice he recognized. Ethan. He turned, his heart pounding. Standing at the edge of the street, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, was Clara. She looked just as she had in his apartment, her dark hair framing her face, her green eyes filled with that same mixture of sadness and urgency. Clara, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Is it really you? She nodded, but there was no time for explanations. Listen to me, she said, her voice urgent. It's happening. The choice is coming. And when it does, you have to be ready. Ethan took a step toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. No, she said. Don't come closer. There's no time. Just listen. Ethan froze, his heart racing. What's happening? What choice? Clara's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. You're going to be given a chance to change something, she said. Something from your past. Something you've always regretted. But you can't do it, Ethan. You can't change it. If you do, it will destroy everything. Ethan's mind raced. What was she talking about? What could he possibly want to change so badly that it would risk everything? I don't understand, he said, his voice breaking. What am I supposed to do? Clara took a deep breath, her form beginning to shimmer just as it had before. You have to let go, she said. You have to accept that some things can't be changed, no matter how much you want to. Before Ethan could respond, Clara began to fade, her form dissolving into the night air. Wait, he cried, reaching out for her. But she was gone, leaving only the echo of her words behind. Ethan stood there, his hands still outstretched, his heart aching with a loss he couldn't fully understand. He didn't know what to do, what to think. But one thing was clear, the choice was coming. And he wasn't ready. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan tried to go about his life as normal, but the weight of Clara's warning hung over him like a shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. Something that would change everything. Then, one night, it happened. Ethan was in his apartment, staring out the window at the city skyline, when he felt it, a strange pull like a magnet drawing him in. He turned, his heart pounding, and saw it. A door. It wasn't there before. He was sure of it. But now, standing in the middle of his living room was a door. It was old and weathered, its wood cracked and splintered, its handle rusted with age. And yet, there was something about it, something familiar. Ethan approached the door cautiously, his heart racing. He reached out and touched the handle, and as soon as he did, he felt a jolt like an electric shock. The door swung open, revealing not the hallway of his apartment building, but a swirling, shimmering vortex of light. Ethan stared into the vortex, his mind reeling. He didn't know what it was, but he felt drawn to it as if it were calling to him. He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing on the threshold. And then he saw it. A memory. Not his own, but one that felt familiar, as if it had been buried deep within him. He saw a young boy, no more than 10 years old, standing in a park. The boy was crying, his face streaked with tears, his hands clutching a broken toy. And then he saw himself older, but not by much, walking away, leaving the boy behind. The memory hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He remembered that day. He remembered the boy. It was his younger brother, Alex. They had been playing in the park when Alex's favorite toy had broken. Ethan had been frustrated, annoyed that Alex was crying over something so trivial. He had walked away, leaving Alex alone. It was a small moment, one he had almost forgotten. But now, seeing it again, he felt a wave of guilt and regret. He had been cruel, thoughtless, and he had never apologized. As the memory faded, Ethan realized what the choice was. The door, the vortex, it was a chance to go back. To change that moment. To be the brother Alex had needed. Ethan's heart raced. He wanted to step through the door to fix his mistake. But then he remembered Clara's words. You have to let go. You have to accept that some things can't be changed. He hesitated, torn between the desire to make things right and the fear of what might happen if he did. What if changing this moment created a ripple effect, altering the course of his life in ways he couldn't predict? What if it erased Clara or the older Ethan or even himself? Ethan stood there, staring into the vortex, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing for certain. The choice was his. Ethan stood at the threshold of the door, the vortex swirling before him like a living thing. The memory of his younger brother, Alex, played on a loop in his mind. The broken toy, the tears, the moment he had walked away. It was a small moment, but it carried a weight he hadn't realized until now. The guilt gnawed at him, urging him to step through, to fix what he had broken. But Clara's warning echoed in his ears. You have to let go. You have to accept that some things can't be changed. He clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This was the choice. The one the older Ethan had warned him about. The one Clara had begged him not to make. If he stepped through that door, he could change the past. He could be the brother Alex had needed. But at what cost? Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought about the older Ethan, trapped in the asylum, consumed by regret. He thought about Clara, a ghost of a life that had been erased. He thought about the photographs, the man who looked like him, appearing throughout history, always watching, always alone. And then he thought about Alex, his brother who had grown up distant, their relationship strained by years of unspoken resentment. What if this one moment had been the turning point? What if fixing it could change everything? The pull of the vortex was irresistible. Ethan felt himself leaning forward, his foot hovering over the threshold. He wanted to step through. He wanted to make things right. But then he stopped. Something inside him, a voice, a feeling, an instinct, told him to wait. To think. To remember. He thought about Clara's words. Sometimes the hardest choice is the one to let go. He thought about the older Ethan's warning. Every action has consequences. Every change ripples through the timeline. And he thought about himself. About who he was and who he wanted to be. Ethan stepped back from the door, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo his mistakes. But he could learn from them. He could be better. He could reach out to Alex now, as he was, and try to mend what had been broken. As soon as he made the decision, the door began to fade. The vortex shimmered and dissolved, leaving only the empty space of his living room. The pull was gone, the choice made. Ethan sank to the floor, his body trembling with relief and exhaustion. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he had done the right thing. He had chosen to let go. The next morning, Ethan woke with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in weeks. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a lesson. He picked up his phone and dialed Alex's number. It had been months since they had spoken, but Ethan didn't care. He needed to hear his brother's voice. The phone rang once, twice, and then Alex answered. "Ethan? Is everything okay?" Ethan smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Everything's okay. I wanted to talk. To say I'm sorry." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Alex's voice, softer now. "For what?" "For a lot of things," Ethan said. "But mostly for that day in the park. When your toy broke and I walked away. I shouldn't have done that. I should have been there for you." Alex was silent for a moment and then he laughed. A small, surprised laugh. "I remember that day," he said. "I was so mad at you. But Ethan, that was a long time ago. We were kids." "I know," Ethan said. "But I've been carrying it with me. And I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. That I want to be better. For you." There was another pause, and then Alex's voice, warm and genuine. "Thanks, Ethan. That means a lot. Maybe we can get together soon. Talk about it. And other stuff." Ethan smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. "I'd like that." As the days passed, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The door, the vortex, the older Ethan, Clara. They were all gone, but their lessons remained. He had made his choice and it had changed him, not by altering the past, but by shaping the future. He continued his work at the archives, but now it felt different. The old newspapers and photographs no longer felt like relics of a distant past. They felt like pieces of a story he was a part of but not bound by. One evening, as he was packing up to leave, he found something tucked into the corner of a box. It was a photograph, old and faded, but unmistakable. It showed a man standing on a crowded street, his face turned slightly away from the camera. He was wearing a long coat and a hat, and he looked at peace. Ethan stared at the photograph, a smile tugging at his lips. It was him, or rather a version of him. But this time, there was no sadness in the man's eyes, no weight of regret. There was only calm. Ethan tucked the photograph into his bag and headed home, the city lights glowing around him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. The past was behind him. The future was ahead. And the present was his to live.